All right, welcome. It's been a long time since we've done a Fixing Your Agile Coaching. I'm your host, Ryan Ripley. With me today is Michael Lloyd. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Hey, it's been a long time coming. I've seen you all over LinkedIn and other platforms talking about Agile coaching, dysfunction mapping, even some good old-fashioned Scrum mastery. And so I feel like we probably have bumped into each other 20 or 30 different times. And so good to actually get to talk.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I've been obviously following your work for a long time. A big inspiration for a lot of the stuff that I was doing in the early days, and particularly with fixing my Scrum. So yeah, it's nice to be here.
Oh, I appreciate that. Before we got started, we were talking about, kind of the journey through Agile coaching and almost the idea that Agile coaching could be almost taboo right now. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like where you started, how you progressed, and some of those things that have led you to wanting to share, methods like dysfunction mapping with the rest of the coaching and the Agile communities?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I think the story that I have is probably the same as a lot of coaches, right? Which is to say, I kind of found agile as a concept when I first entered into tech and realized that this was something really cool and could really help teams. And so I wanted to become someone that helped people with these sorts of problems. But I kind of sucked at the beginning, like a lot of us. There's not a lot of guidance. There's not a lot of training beyond here's a framework, go do it. And so we often have to kind of learn the hard way things like not just telling people how to do things and figuring out how to experimentally solve problems and how to measure for change and all these sorts of things. But yeah, it took me a while to figure it all out. And eventually I got to a point where I think I'm pretty effective at what I do. I think I've got a track record of pretty good success. And when I started getting on LinkedIn and talking to other coaches and kind of being a part of the community, so to speak, I realized that a lot of people seem to still be stuck where I was back in year one. And kind of the conclusion I've drawn is that as a community, we've done a really bad job of kind of sharing the explicit stuff beyond just the, here's a framework, here's Scrum, here's safe, whatever it is. And we need to do more to actually help people get into the real practical solving problems and making things better. And so I decided to kind of take my approach that I had originally built just for me, give it a name, kind of structure it into a workshop and teach it to people. And that's kind of blown up. I think the demand has kind of demonstrated that there really is a need for more of that stuff. And it gives people an easier way to kind of maybe learn from my mistakes and not make the same mistakes that I did.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be some kind of market for sense making, right? So if you can give people a tool that helps them figure out kind of where they're at, kind of where they should go, give them a few ideas for an experiment, kind of help them understand. I think what's novel about what you're doing is you really force people to dig into the trade-offs of the experiment, right? So if we go down this path, you're leaving this, this, and this behind, and you might be ignoring this, this, and this issue. And so I think really having to think through it reminds me of Weinberg's rule of three. Jerry Weinberg's book Secrets of Consulting is a popular one in the Agile for Humans world. And that rule of three is that if you don't have three really well thought out options or ideas, you haven't thought hard enough. And I think the dysfunction mapping, kind of the structures from my rudimentary understanding of it, it's really honoring that principle of we're really going to think hard about options. We're going to look very hard about trade-offs. We're going to look at root causes. We're going to look at, secondary and tertiary causes. We're going to look at impacts and try to figure out what trade-offs are we willing to make? What trade-offs are we not willing to make? And then let it rip and see what happens. But there's a lot of good thinking that's happening all throughout, that process of gathering that information.
Yeah, and a big part of it, like I say, is me having learned from making mistakes in the past is this we go in one of two extremes often, right? We either just kind of put the blinders on and focus on one thing and at the expense of all others, and then potentially that thing gets better, but everything else gets worse. Or we hit that kind of analysis paralysis if we try to kind of look at everything and change everything, and then we can't possibly understand, in a complex system, which things are affected by which things. And so it's part of the it's one of the more interesting things that always happens in the workshop, which is people at first get a little bit paralyzed and they're like, oh, well, should I connect this to this, or does this go here? Like, what's the correct answer? And it's like, well, there isn't a correct answer. You're just trying to consider as big of the picture as is possible, and then eventually take that knowledge and just zoom in on a part and say, right, this is what I'm going to isolate. This is what I'm going to do. These are the things I expect to change. These are the things that I think probably won't change. And now I'm going to see what happens when I do that. And sometimes it all works out exactly as expected, and you're like, cool, I can move on to the next thing. Sometimes it's completely different, and now you've learned something and you can reassess. And that's kind of the mindset I'm just trying to get people into is, yeah, you don't actually know in advance if you have the right answer. You just have to put some boundaries in place and give it a go.
Well, that's an experiment, right? And I think that's something that our community gets really backwards. It's you don't know the outcome of an experiment. There's no right answer up front. You should be surprised every once in a while if you're truly experimenting and trying things in a complex environment. And to developers, this is natural, right? So if you come from a software development background, it's the test-driven development type world. You try something, you try a small change within the context of this larger application and a testing harness, and you see what happens and you see what cause it and effect it has. And rather than changing every piece of code at once, you're trying these minor changes and making sure that you're getting the outcomes you want. And so from an old programmer's mind, it's like, no, this just makes sense, right? You're basically hacking your way through. Hacking is a crude term for it, but you're hacking your way through organizational dysfunction, baggage with people and teams, and you're really just making small changes with a good testing harness to see if I pull this string, what 7 other strings tighten up and which one loosens up, and what do I make of that? And so it's a really neat kind of setup. But what I really like is about these types of tools that come from a need is really the origin, right? And so I think you've been very expressive on LinkedIn about in the beginning you weren't good, and in the beginning I wasn't good. I mean, I that totally resonates with me. I used to do a conference talk 10 years ago. Man, we're getting old. Used to do a talk 10 years ago about that transition from project manager to scrum master, and how for the first year I was just a total rubbish scrum master. Like I was acting like a project manager, but I think what made the difference was, first of all, community. I had really good people around me saying, "Hey, you're not doing a good job," which was really helpful. But they did it in a more loving and caring way than I would have done. But secondly was this desire to get better and a lot of the hard work that goes into it. And so, going to various courses, reading a ton of books, talking to as many people about this stuff as you can, getting to the conferences, really trying out different things in the workplace, trying different, the Wardley maps, the dysfunction mapping, the whatever tool was around, when new things would come out, giving things a try, liberating structures for facility, whatever it is, just trying to stretch and into places that we weren't good at to try to get good. And it seems like your journey is very similar, right? It's just I wasn't good. I worked like crazy to get good, and now I'm trying to share that out. Have I represented you fairly?
Yeah, I think so. And it's I think one of the things that always surprises me sometimes is that as an industry that, like agile coaches, scrum masters, this sort of group of people, that we talk so much about continuous improvement, that we also seem to be really stuck in 10 and 20-year-old sort of frameworks and tools that really haven't changed that much for a very, very long time. And it feels to me that like an obvious part of continuous improvement is not just learning either ideas, but synthesizing them, tweaking them, testing them, changing them, coming up with new ideas. And that's the part that feels to me like we've kind of lost in the last decade or so. Like I remember, when I was first getting into this about 10 years ago, a lot of this stuff still felt somewhat new. And in the time since, very little new has come along. So I guess that's part of what I'm trying to offer, right? Is certainly this is not the best solution to every problem. Certainly there are things about it that are, not going to work in certain contexts or whatever. But it was a synthesis of several ideas that helped me really heavily tweaked for a really particular problem that I'm trying to solve. And now people can play with it and hopefully come up with their own ideas. And I think that's part of the learning journey as well, right? Because just replicating what other people do is the first step on the ladder. Like it's shuhari to a degree, right? Like this is my version of all the things that I've learned. This is me kind of becoming the rule, and I think we all need to practice this mindset to some extent.
And I think part of what you're observing is just natural, right? There is an ossification, and I think I'm stealing that from Tim Ottinger,
Mm,
um, of different frameworks and communities. To change the Scrum Guide, for example. Well, now Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org have to change their assessments, and the courses have to be updated, and the trainers have to. Well, hopefully the trainers refresh and adopt the new language in their courses. And there's this cascading mountain of work that just has to occur, and so change becomes difficult, right? And
mm,
so you don't see a lot of changes to um and I'm glad. I don't want a Scrum Guide change this year.
mm,
Like, I actually think we're still working through the implications of the latest change. I don't think people fully understand the ramifications of the changes that have already occurred. Um, but you get into this situation where it's very difficult to change those things. I
yeah.
think SAFe is in the same boat. I think Kanban, with the creation of a Kanban guide by Pro Kanban, will start moving in that direction. Where it will start to ossify a little bit. And I'm not necessarily certain it's bad. I think stability in core frameworks could be good, but to your point, it does seem to slow down change and progress a little bit. And
Mm,
so I think those things are natural. It's nice with these tools like dysfunction mapping, and you can still tweak and change things, but at some point, when you start to certify people, what does that certification mean? Is that what version 1.0 of dysfunction mapping? Is it version 6.0? And then
mm.
does that mean that the people on 1.0 are no longer certified like 6.0? And I think that all those implications start coming in, right? That some of it's natural, and I think some of it's laziness, and hopefully we're more on the natural side of it than the lazy.
Yeah, I would generally agree, and I certainly agree with the idea of like we don't need another version of the Scrum Guide right now, right? So
Right.
I'm not in any way saying that things need to be constantly changing at a breakneck speed, but I think one of the mistakes maybe that we've made as a community is an over reliance on kind of a fixed structure for doing things that doesn't spend enough time thinking about the actual outcome of the thing. And that probably sounds a bit vague, but I guess what I'm saying is something like Scrum, right? Which I'm a big fan of. I'm PSM3. I teach Scrum, like not in any way opposed to Scrum as a concept. Um, but I think we spend far too much time talking about Scrum for its own sake, and
Yep.
especially as we've kind of continued to generalize it and make it less about your product delivery in a software sense. Um, it's become really, really easy to just talk about doing Scrum instead of the outcomes achieved by Scrum. And so I think that naturally lends us to therefore demonstrating our capability or our competence as how well do we know the context of Scrum rather than how well can we use Scrum to solve problems. And
Well,
so, sorry, go ahead.
no, it's a great observation, and I've thought about why this is the case.
Mm,
Why is it that we're so fixated on Scrum and not on delivery? And I think part of it, and I know you've written in roundabout ways on this on LinkedIn, and as have I recently. Um, Perhaps it's just the community now is full of people who have never actually delivered a product.
right.
I do think we have agile coaches and scrum masters running around who have never actually worked on a team in a builder or delivery type setting, and so they don't know anything other than the framework.
Right.
And that and
Yeah.
that Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say,
I'll
I
let
like,
you get in trouble too with some of these statements I'm making.
yeah, well, this is it because I do try to talk about this quite often because it creates pushback, and therefore that tells me it's a conversation that we need to be
Yep.
having more. But yeah, I think there's a real issue with this idea that Scrum or any of these sort of concepts, tools, frameworks have value absent the domain, the product, the thing that we're trying to deliver, which I think we all know isn't true. But if we follow the thread that it's not independently valuable, then it's kind of implied that you have to be able to then tie it to the thing that is independently valuable, the delivery, let's say. And if you don't have those skills, then it's hard to kind of stand by your own value proposition, right? And like I say, this is why I'm kind of trying to do it in a slightly different way with dysfunction mapping that I'm sure we'll get back to. But like, I think we need to focus more on what are the outcomes that we're actually achieving with this approach, and rather than certifying knowledge of the framework, certifying the outcomes that are achieved, and then it prevents us from getting into this kind of backwards or like negative reinforcing loop that I think
Yep.
we're currently in, which is, well, if the only way of demonstrating that I'm a really good Scrum Master, for example, is to have a really anal retentive knowledge of what's written in the Scrum guide and be able to correct people's language, because that's the only thing that we're actually checking against, then you just breed more of that behavior. Whereas if we actually maybe codified, or at least were just more openly willing to talk about some of the real outcomes that should be a requirement for, say, a Scrum Master in a product delivery team, then we would be able to focus on those things instead. But that's the bit that seems absent to me at the moment.
I would argue a little bit that, and now you're a person who's passed PSM3. I would say that it does delve into that. I also think, the PST journey, which, I mean, I had to go through to become a trainer. There are a lot of discussions about the outcomes of your work and being able to articulate the outcomes. And so I do think there again, it's not the majority. I certainly agree that we need more of it. But I do think there are some attempts at stepping into that void a little bit. And so, but no, totally agree. Those conversations, that needs to be the focus, right?
Yeah.
The outcomes of the work and the ability to deliver, rather. I mean, it's why Todd and I are so amped up over evidence-based management. Let's actually talk about the value we're delivering, the struggles we're having to deliver, what's going on in the market, all of those great things, and let's make that, let's make that the thing. And then the framework or the tool or the method or the, including dysfunction mapping and all those other things. Those are the things, those are the vehicles that get us to this thing that's really important that we need to measure and look at. So no, wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah. I guess the one thing that I think is worth following up a little bit on there, because again, obviously agree with what you're saying, but the thing that always shocks me is when you dive into the numbers, right? Because you talk about like PSM3 does absolutely check that you've got
Yeah.
actual practical knowledge of Scrum, right? Like you cannot pass that exam without knowing your shit, essentially.
Yeah.
The problem is, right, 600,000 people have a PSM1 and only 1,200 have a PSM3. And I actually did that as a little conference talk experiment recently. It's like you plot it on a pie graph, and it's 0.001% of the total, right? So it's so small that on a pie graph you can't actually even see the quantity of people. And so, I'm not a person that thinks certifications are the be all and end all, but it absolutely seems clear to me that there is a focus problem, that we're more concerned with creating more entry-level PSM1 holders than we are helping people on that path to mastery. And again, I certainly am not trying to throw shade at individual Scrum trainers. Obviously, I know you and a lot of others that are fantastic at what you do, and this is the system that we're in. We've got a market, we've got job hiring practices that kind of push people towards just get your PSM1 and then go get a job and then learn all of the like practical skills in a highly dysfunctional organization where they're probably going to get everything wrong.
Sure.
But I guess that's the point, right? Is the only way to change that is to start offering other alternatives. And I think EBM is certainly a part of that, but I think it goes a little bit deeper. And I believe, I've said this online again, in a little bit of trouble for it sometimes, but I believe that Scrum.org should stop offering the PSM1 as a like class. Like, I'm just not sure that there is value in continuing to do that as a, and keeping it as the minimum benchmark essentially for Scrum. I think that should just be a self-assessment. It's not enough to demonstrate that you're really a Scrum Master, and you should at least get a PSM2 and go to an advanced Scrum class if you want to be able to sort of hit the minimum requirement for getting a job, which is, I think, what would naturally happen if that shift happened. But that would probably cost Scrum.org a lot of money. And again, there's a lot of other decisions that play into it, but I don't suspect that's going to happen. I guess the point I'm just making is that there are clearly changes that need to be made in the long term.
Oh, I think there's no. I would welcome that change. If Todd and I could have our way, we would teach more advanced Scrum Master courses than anything else. We love that class. Like, it's a really good experience. I think we just finished one up a week or two ago, and every time right? You get 20 or so people into an advanced Scrum Master class, and they're walking into it going, yeah, I've done this for a year or two, and I'm feeling really good about where I'm at. And by the end of it, they're sitting there going, oh no, I've got a long ways to go. And we're sitting there going, awesome. That's all we wanted. That if we can get you out of here realizing that you're in a good place and you're doing some good work, but man, there's this whole body of work that you haven't even looked at yet. And there's this whole journey that you still get to go down. Like, to me, that's exciting. I miss the beginner eyes kind of viewpoint of Scrum. And I try to get into that as much as I can. But after, almost 15 years and teaching and training it and using it and screwing it up in every possible way you can imagine, it's hard to get back to that. And so I'm actually envious of these people that, they've been doing Scrum for a few years. They think they've mastered it. They step into this advanced Scrum Master course and they just it's like a bolt of lightning. I mean, it's whoa, I've really got to, the professionalism has to increase, the understanding of agility, the purpose of why, the fact that we're here to ship, we're here to deliver, right? It doesn't matter if my Scrum events are the most entertaining, which is what they're turning into with all of this infantilization of the events. This whole, oh, let's have a Harry Potter themed retro and then go get a beer. And and I made butter beer for everybody. And it's just like, did we ship something or not? And did we do it well? And do our stakeholders love us or hate us? And if not, how are we going to fix that? And so, no, I'm on board. I would love to see that next step. And I think part of it is on the certifying bodies, right? And on the trainers. So I'm part of that problem. How do I get more people into the advanced courses? But I also think the other half of the equation is there are many Scrum Masters out there and Agile coaches and whatever people are calling themselves now, that whatever it is that do not see the need to continue their journey, who are completely satisfied with entry level and no more. And part of that's on them, and now, have we incentivized it correctly? Have we, I mean, there's a lot of work we can do on our side. Don't get me wrong, but there has to be motivated, energized, willing people who want to spend the next 10 years becoming amazing at product delivery. And that's essential too, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's, funnily enough, it's kind of the other pillar of what I was trying to do, dysfunction mapping, or what I have been trying to do. And I'm sorry, my dogs are going crazy in the background.
Dogs are welcome. All good.
Too loud. But one of the things that dysfunction mapping helped me to do when I was developing it as a tool for me was to better understand Scrum. And I've run some workshops, and I was planning it as a longer term series, but it didn't really pan out. But I was using dysfunction mapping as a PSM3 workshop, so to teach PSM3, because I think this is the sort of context that actually is fantastic for getting that really, really deep understanding of Scrum. Because one of the things that it forces you to do, and we do this in the workshops, is do something like say, hey, the Scrum Master runs the daily Scrum is a dysfunction. Let's talk about that, right? And it's not about, you cannot or should not ever do that, or there are no places where you shouldn't do that, but you should understand that that is essentially a rule of Scrum. You should be able to articulate why that rule exists, and you should be able to identify the negative symptoms that you would expect to see if that is causing a problem, or and vice versa. You can go in both directions for that, and you can do this with a bunch of things. Like, because one of my favorites that I think we almost always talk about is not showing unfinished work at the sprint review. So the Scrum Guide, very, very explicit about that. And I always throw it into my dysfunction mapping classes because it's one of the most contentious ones that I find people, I don't want to say this in too mean a way, but I find that we often try to make excuses for. It's like, well, we want to show unfinished work at the sprint review because it's better to get feedback soon, or, whatever things we want to come up with. And it's like, well, maybe, I'm not saying there's no scenario where that's the not the right answer, but you should be asking and be able to articulate, why does Scrum say that? Why does the Scrum Guide give us that guidance? Like, what is the problem it's trying to solve? And are we potentially treating symptoms instead of treating the underlying problem, right? So is it perhaps possible that the reason that we feel the need to show unfinished work at the sprint review is because we're not talking to our customers enough the rest of the time. We don't have short enough feedback loops elsewhere. And actually, by not addressing that, we're having other impacts. And so I think part of what this kind of way of thinking builds into us is, dysfunction is not necessarily to say this thing is bad in all circumstances. It's, hey, we're doing this thing or not doing this thing. It's having consequences that we don't like. Can we understand what's going on here? And can we, articulate a solution to it? And again, I think this is part of that learning process, right? Is we have to, as coaches, as scrum masters, whatever, even as leaders, we have to understand how these structures and frameworks and tools enable us to achieve the goals that we're trying to achieve. And if we're just doing it because it's in a textbook or whatever, we saw a YouTube video, we are going to just make things worse. So, yes, you want to solve problems. Dysfunction mapping helps with that. But you also want to actually understand why the problem solving stuff is working. And it helps with that too. So,
well, I think an interesting dysfunction map so I'll be in one of your workshops. I think coming up in November, I'll be joining you for a course. I get to be a student again. So that'll be fun. I'll try to be a good student. They say PSTs are horrible students. And so I'll try to behave myself. But a dysfunction that I really want to explore, whether during the workshop or after, is if there's a job title of Scrum Master in your organization, that's a dysfunction. And
yeah, I love it.
I sparked a pretty large debate on LinkedIn recently that your boss should be your next Scrum Master, and people are losing their minds on that thread. There are and it's primarily CSTs. Like there are Scrum Alliance trainers on there who are revolting against that idea. And I've stopped arguing. I'm like, yeah, cool. Thanks for being here. I'm glad you're commenting. But even a few PSTs don't like it as well. But just the idea that now we talked about the implications of the new Scrum Guide. Well, the Scrum Guide moved Scrum Master, Product Owner, and Developer to a set of accountabilities. It's not a job title anymore. It's not a role. It really wasn't supposed to be. It's a set of accountabilities that you fulfill on a team. And so an engineering manager could fulfill the Scrum Master accountabilities without having the title or the role or the HR code of Scrum Master.
Yeah.
Right. And
yeah.
I actually think that's better. Like
Yeah.
that's the type of dysfunction that I think if you explored, people would lose their minds. But I think your tool would beautifully point out all the dysfunction we're seeing in the community right now, stemming from the fact that we have the role or title of Scrum Master that is somehow now separated from the team and delivery and all of those other things that we need it tied back to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess there's two threads there that are worth exploring. Like one is the dysfunction itself that I basically agree with the point that I've made before. And I even wrote an article on Medium that said the Scrum Master job title should die. Yep. I think that one got me in a bit of trouble, but I stand by everything I said in it. And the basic premise that I made there is that really you've got two types of Scrum Masters today, right? You've got either fairly high productive teams that are well on the journey of Scrum, and you can have a developer taking on the accountability of being a Scrum Master, but their job title should be whatever their actual sort of position in the team is, whether they're, again, HR job titles are not really a thing I care about, but they exist. You might be a tester, you might be a developer, you might be something else, who cares? But you can take on the accountability of a Scrum Master. And then the other type are probably people like us, people that haven't been actively building products for a while. Our expertise, our specialty is helping teams that are really struggling or maybe just getting started. And so they need someone really focused on the getting better at Scrum, at product delivery, whatever it is. And so we're probably not doing other stuff. We're just focused on the Scrum Master accountability. So if we're in the Scrum team, we might take on that accountability, but we're still an Agile coach, which is the thing that we really do. And there's obviously arguments about whether even Agile coach is a job or a title is right. I don't really care. My point is just that, well, an Agile coach and a Scrum Master are not a different thing. I'm an Agile coach. When I'm helping a Scrum team, I might take on the accountability of a Scrum Master. And when I'm helping other teams, I won't, like that. But I'm still just doing the Agile coaching, right? That's kind of my view. But even then, like, I guess the second thread that I think is really important, and where people I think often miss my lines of thinking sometimes, is that even when I say that, and I believe quite strongly that that's all true, given my experiences, I cannot know the best answer or the best solution or the best setup for every organization or every team and every time. That's silly, right? So what I want is not for people to just say, oh, Mike said this, I'm going to do that. I want people to think, well, okay, I'm listening to what he said, but I'm going to see what makes sense in my context, and I'm going to try things. And this is kind of the whole point with dysfunction mapping, right? It's like I could put a dysfunction on there that says Scrum Master is a job title, and we should be able to have a conversation about, cool, what are the symptoms we would expect to see, or what symptoms are we seeing that we would tie to that? Why does solving this dysfunction help us? Like, what's the purpose of not having Scrum Master as a job title? But equally, you could take the opposite view, right? And you could say, well, maybe the dysfunction is we don't have Scrum Masters as job titles, because maybe in our context, we actually need the organization to wholesale buy into Scrum. We need to make it explicit. We need to use the language. So
Sure.
maybe in this context, our dysfunction is we don't have formal Scrum Masters. Cool. What are the symptoms you're trying to solve? What's the purpose of making this change? What are we going to measure? That's all I'm trying to get people to do is understand that there isn't a right or wrong to this. There are often patterns that you can lean on, which is why I talk about dysfunction, right? There are things that we know have worked for others, we're not doing them, and we're seeing these negative outcomes. Let's say that that's a dysfunction and follow that thread. But ultimately, you could pick one of a million dysfunctions, and almost all of them, if thought through in the appropriate way with the proper boundaries, will lead you to an improvement that is measurable. And that's all we're after, right? Does stuff get better? Yes or no? Who cares how we got there?
Yeah, no, I think it's I think one of the more powerful aspects of dysfunction mapping is just that right there. You could frame it either way. You could look at the pros, the cons, the dysfunction, the symptoms, the causes, all of those things. Come up with an experiment, measure it. If it moved the needle in a good direction, amplify it. If it didn't, find another one. Right? It's what I like about it is it's definitely evidence based as well. Right? We have a hypothesis. We have a means to know whether or not we think it's a pass or a fail, a success or a failure, whatever criteria you want to put on it, and then let's let it rip. Let's do it, and that's actual improvement, which is nice. It's as opposed to themed retros. What if a retro was just a dysfunction mapping session?
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
that
and it's
so much more progress could be made.
right. Yeah, so funny enough, there's two elements of that. Like my general view is that dysfunction mapping is a much bigger thing than could be confined to a single retro. However,
Totally agree. Wasn't trying to put it in a box.
no, I get that, but I guess the point there as well is I'm also biased, and it may well be that someone could do it in a retro and get the value from it. So I certainly wouldn't prevent anyone from trying, but it is intended to be a bigger picture approach. However, two things that I know you can think about is Dave Westgarth, who makes a bunch of great Miro templates, created a template for dysfunction mapping retrospective, which is really, really cool, and it really distills it down to like core loops really, really quickly. But the thing that I often do is I like to break it up, and so in one retro, we might just talk about the dysfunction symptom relationship and come up with some ideas. And then in the next retro, we're going to talk about purpose and solution, and then get a next set of experiments. And you can weave it and build it over time. Either way, though, to your point, it's like, yeah, it's about how are we going to get into the mindset of regularly running those experiments and seeing what changes? Because I sometimes struggle when I talk to Scrum Masters, and I've been in the position of having to interview and hire Scrum Masters into jobs several times, and it sometimes just like flabbergasts me when you ask questions about like, oh, cool, so you ran this experiment, you did this thing. How did you know you were successful? And you just get like just trust me, bro. Like, what do you mean measures? What?
Yeah. Why are you
Yeah,
asking? Like,
right,
who
exactly.
sent
It's like,
you?
yeah. Oh, velocity improved. Oh, great, sure.
Well,
So
so
yeah,
what? Did we add another person? Is that how we increase velocity, or did we?
it's funny
Velocity is
because
capacity. Everybody, please stop this. It's capacity. No,
I
I
literally go on. Sorry,
I didn't mean to put it in a box there.
no, it's
I
fine.
think it could be a neat tool there. I actually, when I really took a deeper dive into dysfunction mapping, I sat here and thought, wow, there's finally a systems thinking tool that I don't need a PhD to apply. Right. And so I see it definitely applicable to the much larger systems of work that we're in the middle of. But yeah,
Well,
I think there's definitely great things that come out of that. If you could use it in a retro, I think the way that you described it is really good. Just breaking it apart and having different aspects. But no, I think it's really that would be like putting training wheels on a bike. I think the systems aspect of it and the ability to really get that bigger picture is even more compelling.
Yeah, like I said, that's kind of my approach. Like, it is a system thinking tool. That's largely what informed it. I don't know if it was a deliberate allusion to causal loop diagramming there, but that was one of the things that really incentivized me to create this. Is I love causal loop diagramming. I think it's a great approach, but I have never seen it enable like really quick, simple conversation. So
Right.
like it's a difficult thing for people to get their heads around. And this is essentially me just simplifying that approach down to like a little linear flow of one part of a causal loop diagram. But again, that's the point is just like, how do we get better at thinking about the system, coming up with a hypothesis, and testing things?
I think that's your new tagline, right? Systems thinking without the PhD. There you go.
Love it.
Yeah, I'll take my 2 quid every time you put it somewhere.
Yeah, deal.
No, just teasing. Great tool. And I like the direction that, that it's going in. I think, like I said, I'm excited to see it in November. Hopefully, um, I'm able to grasp it, and that I also behave in the course. I will do my level best. Um, but definitely excited to see it in action, and because I mean, just for me, I'm sure I have a very limited view of it.
Mm,
And I think this happens a lot. I know a number of people I've spoken with about dysfunction mapping, a number of them, and I want to give you a chance to kind of address this,
mm.
because I've seen this in the comments, and this is not my belief. This is just something. It shows up in the comments. It shows up in conversation. Some people look at this and say, "Well, he's just repackaged root cause analysis. Why is this interesting?" And so when you hear that, and I'm sure you've heard that a number of times, what's kind of how do you kind of flip that back and say, no, it's really more than that?
I mean, I'm not sure I necessarily feel the need to. Like, I think if you
Oh,
if you view it as just a type of root cause analysis, great, right? And if you've got an approach to root cause analysis that explicitly helps you get to a measurable hypothesis in a reasonable amount of time, you maybe don't need dysfunction mapping, right?
I don't
That's
think people have
absolutely
that.
fine.
So
Exactly.
that's kind of the
So
funny part. I don't think that exists, but
right.
that's still kind of the flippant
Yeah.
criticism that gets tossed out, right?
Like I said, and that's exactly why, it came to be. It's certainly why I'm sharing it and why people seem to be resonating with it, is because this is, it's part root cause analysis and then part form a hypothesis and actually create a measurable experiment. Um, but it's particularly built for a very specific
Yeah.
context, right? This is for complex product delivery teams and organizations. This is, it certainly has, I think, a wider possible use case in that. Like, I've had people contact me saying they've used it in other contexts, which is really cool. But I built it from my experience, from my problems, and it turns out there are hundreds of thousands of people around the world struggling with the same problems that I'm struggling with. So cool. It's just more, right? It's hyper specialized to give people like us a quicker path to a measurable experiment. If you have been doing this sort of work for years, you have probably already developed your own approach to doing something like this, in which case, cool, you don't need dysfunction mapping. That's fine. But if you're someone that has either struggled to get to that point quickly and think a tool would help, or you're someone like me who's maybe a bit ADHD, and even if you have a system, you actually benefit from the structure of saying, right, this is the thing I'm going to do, and then this is the thing I'm going to do. So again, it helps in that regard. But I'm very careful to I don't try to sell this as a silver bullet, right? It's not going to solve all your problems. It's not magic. It's just a structure to help you get to experiments. And if that's the sort of thing you are struggling with, or you just would like to see if this approach is better than what you currently do, give it a try. If it works, great. If it doesn't, tweak it, change it, or throw it in the bin. Up to you.
I like it. Fair enough. Well, Michael, I appreciate you doing this. I know you've got a busy day ahead of you. I think we could talk about Scrum and dysfunction mapping and other things for hours and hours and hours. So hopefully we do this again. But anything you'd like to, and by the way, I will get links to dysfunction mapping, the articles, the classes, all of that into the show notes. So anyone looking for that, it's in the description on the YouTube channel. So be sure to check that out. But Michael, anything you want to promote or get in front of people before we wrap this one up?
Yeah, so the main thing, like, obviously, for the links, I've got a couple of public classes. So actually, I have two versions: the practitioner class, which is the one that I've been building for over a year, and the leader class, which is a new thing that I've been developing to solve a particular problem. Obviously, you can go to my website or look into that in more detail. I also can come in and do private classes, right? So I do an 8-hour or 2 4-hour hands-on workshop, liberating structures, build a dysfunction map with people, putting it into practice and learn by doing. So if you've got a team or an organization that you think that would benefit from that, please just reach out. I've got I just love running these sessions. They seem to really help people. They're a lot of fun, and I think if you are willing to experiment with a slightly different way of doing things, dysfunction mapping can be a fantastic way to get there. But also, if you just want to give it a try and you don't want to, pay for me to come in and run a course, just reach out and let me know what you're doing. I'd love to just be a sounding board and help you through it. Like, I'm not just in this for selling courses. Like, I genuinely want to help practitioners improve. So yeah, happy to do that.
Wonderful. No, I appreciate that, Michael. And again, thanks for doing this, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
Yeah, thank you, mate. It was good to talk to you. We'll talk again soon.
All right, everybody, be sure to like and subscribe so you never miss great conversations with great people like Michael. Hit that bell, and that'll make sure you never miss those in the future. Be sure to check out the socials. There's a lot going on there. I'll also put up a number of Michael's links on LinkedIn and on X, I guess it's called now. And so be sure to check those out if you're looking for those links. Some videos are going to pop up. The algorithm thinks you'll like them. We do too. One of them is our Scrum 101 course. To Michael's point, flip through that, take your PSM1 and go conquer the world, right? Move on to the advanced stuff. But for Michael, I'm Ryan. Go forward, do some great things in the world, find some dysfunction, find some nice ideas around it, see if you can solve it or get a little better at Scrum. You pick, but in either case, let's improve, and we'll see you next time.